friend of mine approached me recently and asked me to recommend some books to her, and when I asked her what kind of books she liked, she said that she didn't really know because she's been reading a lot of textbooks for uni, and so she's kind of not read anything for fun. And so I came up with a list of 5 books that I think would be really good for people who don't know what kind of books they like. So I've tried to go for a broad range of books. I'm not necessarily saying that these are like the best books in their genre, but just that they are books that I think are particularly good at kind of introductions to each of the genres, so they're maybe like a little bit easier to read or have a particularly like gripping story. So even if they're not like best character development or anything like that, it's just the best book that I have read that I think that I would recommend to somebody else if they weren't sure what kind of books they liked to read. So the first book on my list might not come as a surprise to people that have watched my videos before, but I think my recommendation for an introduction to young adult fantasy would be Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. I absolutely adore this trilogy. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I just think it's really beautifully written. The story is very interesting. I think it's quite unique. And it's not too heavy going, so it's not like you have to remember the names of like thousands and thousands of characters and remember where in the world they are. It's quite a sort of simple storyline, but I think it's really powerful and really effective storyline, so I would definitely recommend this for anyone who wasn't sure whether or not they were interested in fantasy. The next book that I would recommend for somebody who maybe wondered whether they were interested in historical fiction would be The Book Thief. This book isn't very heavy on the historical element of it. There's like other elements of the story that are more important, but the historical element is a key factor in the story at the same time. So it's not really, you don't have to know an awful lot about history in order to understand the book, but the history within the book is very powerful and very like moving and very emotional as well. And so I think it's definitely a good one, but then the story carries its own, so you don't need the history part in order for the story to carry its own. It's a very interesting way of approaching like the voice as well of the character that you are reading. It's quite an unusual and way of portraying somebody. The way that the story is written is from the point of view of somebody reading somebody else's diary, so I think that's a really interesting way of doing it. I actually listened to this audiobook and I really enjoyed it as an audiobook, but I think that I would definitely enjoy reading the book itself as well. But that's a really, really good one. It is quite an emotional book. I cried a lot during this book, but I think it's really, really worth it. It's not too heavy going, like it's not got really long words, it's not really complicated, it's not really deep in like political or like, yeah, historical kind of jargon or anything like that. It is just a really good, interesting and like heart-wrenching story. Number 3 on my list is Metro 2033. This is a book that has been translated from Russian into English. I didn't read this one as like a physical book with my eyes. I listened to this one as an audiobook, and this is a kind of sci-fi dystopian novel. So I would definitely recommend this, one for its sort of sci-fi dystopian element, but also as an audiobook. So if you haven't listened to an audiobook before, I think this would be a really good one to listen to. It is quite a long audiobook, but I think that the person who reads it reads it very, very well, and there's a lot of opportunity to really immerse into the book as a result of it being an audiobook. There are elements of it that I feel like I enjoyed or kind of experienced more deeply because I had listened to it as an audiobook rather than reading it with my eyes. For example, there's a particular sort of monster in it called the Librarians, and the way that they are portrayed in the audiobook with their way that they sort of speak, I guess speak would be the right word, was very creepy. Like, it made my skin crawl, and now whenever anyone says librarian, even if they're talking about just your friendly local librarian. My skin like crawls because I'm thinking of librarians from Metro 2033. So this was a really, really good one. It is quite intense, quite heavy going, but I think that if you are going to enjoy dystopian, even though this isn't like YA, it is quite sort of like heavy dystopian sci-fi type book, I think that you would know from reading this book whether or not you're going to enjoy dystopian books. And then a classic, my favourite classic is Little Women. I particularly like it. It's quite an emotional book, you know, there's lots of sad bits, but it's a bit of an easier one to read. I think I've read things like Jane Eyre, and I've read some of Pride and Prejudice, and I found them quite kind of difficult to get into, but I think just the characters in Little Women are a little bit more interesting. They kind of move the story along a little bit faster. Jo especially, like the main character Jo, she is like very full of energy, very full of life, and she kind of helps the story move along a little bit faster. So I think it's a good introduction to classics and the way that classics are written. Like, they're not action-packed, you know, it is kind of just a book about how life is, and I think that can be quite difficult to get into if you're not 100% sure that you like that kind of stuff. But I think as an introduction to classics, Little Women is a good one. And then finally, my contemporary suggestion would be We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. I really enjoyed this book, and this was really kind of like my introduction to contemporary. I read a lot of fantasy before then. I had read some contemporary, but I was kind of like meh. But this one in particular I really, really enjoyed. There was a little bit of like a sort of twist to it that kind of took it beyond contemporary. It made it a little bit more kind of like mysterious, and there's a bit of a mystery in there, but it's still contemporary, and I think that it's a very interesting story, very interestingly written, and then with it having this kind of twist at the end, it's very interesting. They could very easily have just written a book about a group of friends who like meet each other every summer, and you know, it would be about boys, and it would be like all about romance, or like, you know, something like that. But it's not like that at all. Like, there's elements of that in it, but there is a bigger thing that this story is about, and that makes it very interesting to read and a very gripping read. And I think it would be a very very good introduction to contemporary novels. So there we are, those are my 5 recommendations for new readers. Let me know what your recommendations would be. Do you agree? Do you like strongly disagree with any of the books that I've suggested? Let me know in the comments below. Please do follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat, and you can see me do all of my book things in all the places that I do them. And I will see you next time. Thank you for watching. Bye!